Right, good evening everyone, and welcome to Queen Mary and to the Mile End Institute for our very first event of 2024, the year of elections. My name is Tom Chidwick and I'm the manager of the Institute. And as those of you who are regulars at our events will know, the Institute was established in 2015 by Peter Hennessy to bring together academics and students here at Queen Mary with politicians, policymakers and the public to debate the major challenges facing British politics at a time of, particularly this year, fascinating if not perilous uncertainty for our country. Before I hand over to this illustrious panel, I'd like to draw your attention to our upcoming events. In a packed programme, and I'll spare you my Ronnie Corbett impression, we'll be launching the first in our new Distinguished Hennessy Lecture Series with Sir Simon Sharma in March, welcoming the former Deputy Prime Minister David Lidington at the end of March for an in-conversation with our colleague Dr. Robert Saunders, assessing the Conservative Party and climate change, and we'll be launching new books on New Labour, the history of general elections, and conflict and change in London in the 1980s. And you are all, of course, very welcome to join us. On screen we have 2 dates for your diary. The first is Monday the 26th of February, when a panel of former special advisors, civil servants and academics will be exploring how a new government might reform the centre of government and the workings of the British Constitution. And the second is on Wednesday the 28th of February, and like tonight we'll be marking a significant political anniversary. Myself and Tim Bale will be launching the new Edward Heath Academic Forum, a new group designed to encourage the study of the politics of the 1970s. And we'll be taking you back to the infamous Who Governs election of February 1974, when an embattled technocratic Conservative Prime Minister presiding over a broken Britain, enduring fierce industrial action and rising prices, went to the polls asking for clear authority for the future to take decisions which will be sorely needed. It all sounds familiar. We'll be joined by Dr. Robert Saunders, Tim Bale, and a panel of eyewitnesses from that campaign, including the former Cabinet Secretary Robin Butler. We'll be announcing more speakers over the course of the next few days, so do keep an eye on our website, our Twitter account, and on our mailing list. So on to tonight's proceedings. The panel is going to talk for about an hour or so, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And as you all know, our host this evening possesses one of the most recognisable voices in British broadcasting. Carolyn Quinn is a journalist and a broadcaster who spent 36 years working at the BBC. I'm sure her medal is in the post. She presented the Today programme, PM before becoming the host of the Westminster Hour for 16 years, stepping down last March to spend more time with her family, friends, bass guitar, and fortunately for those of us here tonight, the Mile End Institute. So please welcome our host, Carolyn Quinn.
This is where I check, first of all, that you can hear me, and I think you can, yeah? At the back, right, good. Well, you know, here we are. It was 100 years ago to this very day that James Ramsay MacDonald and his so-called wild men were forming that first Labour government. It's a time when we look back at a government that lasted, just 9 months from January through to November, and yet did make achievements and has perhaps been underestimated by some, has been derided by others, but we will look back at that government's political and legislative achievements, also its early demise, and we'll be exploring the lessons that MacDonald's minority administration may or can offer to future Labour governments. And of course, some say we could be on the brink of another Labour government. Who knows, events, dear boy, events. But let's discuss what we can learn from 1924 in the company of this panel here. And I'm delighted to be welcoming John Cruddas, the senior Labour MP and biographer, and the constitutional specialist and biographer David Torrance. They've both got highly relevant books out, note. And David's book, Wild Men, The Remarkable Story of Britain's First Labour Government. John's A Century of Labour. They are both highly constructive and instructive books if you want to get to grips with this period and what it has taught us since. Along with us as well is Professor Jane Ridley, historian and author of books including George V, Never a Dull Moment, and Dr. Richard Johnson, who is a senior lecturer here at Queen Mary, whose new book, Keeping the Red Flag Flying, will be published in April. So welcome to all of you. And I think, Richard, let's draw on your knowledge first of all. Just give us a sense of the political climate running up to that December 1923 election. What was the mood like? What were the people saying and what were politicians saying?
Thank you. I'm going to stand up here, once a lecturer, always a lecturer. I got some quotes as well that I want to read from this time. Not even on the wildest night of Armistice Week had a crowd been so boisterous in central London. On the 17th of November 1922, Piccadilly Circus was teeming with so many people that all motor traffic was blocked. The throng was mesmerised. Looming above them was an electronic sign on a building fixed to Shaftesbury Avenue. Intermittently, the name of a parliamentary constituency would appear and reveal the winner of a seat in that week's general election. The crowd would erupt in cheers at this new phenomenon, regardless of the victor of the seat. The Manchester Guardian wrote, "The excellence of this electrical device, its swiftness in working, rather left the crowd breathless." The following day, when the light had been switched off and the crowd had abated, the Conservatives emerged with a comfortable majority. The situation looked desperate for the Liberal Party, split between two charismatic leaders, Asquith and Lloyd George. They suffered their worst result to that point. And for the first time, the Labour Party secured second place, both in terms of votes and seats, a position from which it would never do worse in the century to come. Nearly 30% of the electorate had supported Labour, returning 142 Labour MPs, a net gain of 85. The Labour Party is to claim the full privileges of His Majesty's opposition, announced the Evening Standard. And the newspaper reported, with not so keen insight, that John Robert Clines, a diminutive working class Lancastrian MP, would become the first Labour leader of the opposition. And at the state opening of Parliament on the 21st of November 1922, Clines did walk alongside Bonar Law in Black Rod's procession to hear the King's speech. Yet that evening, Clines was deposed by his own MPs. It is in fact the only instance in the history of the Labour Party where an incumbent has been successfully challenged and removed by his MPs. It was Ramsay MacDonald, who was elected 61 to 55 with 25 Labour MPs abstaining, who became the party's new leader and leader of the opposition. MacDonald's core support in that leadership challenge came from the left of the party, a recognition of his opposition to the Great War, and it was a move that they would seriously come to regret in the years to follow. After the 1922 election, the new MP for Stepney, Clement Attlee, wrote excitedly to his brother Rob about the new parliamentary Labour Party. He said, "We are very pleased with the results, which have given us a fine fighting force. We shall have the best intellects of the party in the House now." MacDonald was less impressed. His diaries are full of scathing assessments of his parliamentary comrades. The vain and empty-headed Maclean, the asinine Buchanan, the raucous-voiced Lansbury. He had no idea of treating his colleagues properly, Attlee complained. He used to recall to me the contempt that he had for them, and I thought that was quite wrong. In truth, the PLP was a mixed bag. It contained a collection of ascetics and drunks, workaholics and idlers, careerists and diligent advocates for their constituency interests. Serious divisions emerged over the methods by which the Labour MPs, in their new role as the official opposition, should hold the government to account. And for some, they believed that their role should be a constructive one, to put a challenge to the government to try to seek concessions and to get as much as they could from the government as possible. But other Labour MPs saw little hope of persuading the Conservatives to compromise. And for them, Parliament was an unparalleled public platform to put the ideological case for socialism to the wider world, or at least onto the pages of Hansard. These MPs made long, impassioned speeches in the House of Commons that denounced the evils of the capitalist system and spoke boldly of the new Jerusalem to come. But given that the sheer force of argument was not moving these Conservative MPs closer to socialism, other Labour MPs grew tired of their antics. One Labour MP said, "I have little sympathy for this kind of fighting. 3 or 4 speeches are enough to do all that is required. There is something pathetic, if not mad, in so many men behaving like parrots and wasting days and nights in the process." And for the Labour leader of the opposition, these antics were deeply embarrassing. MacDonald seethed, quote, "Some members do no work, but much talking, and wish to turn the floor of the House into some sort of national street corner soapbox." During a debate over cuts to milk provision in Scotland, Thatcher the milk snatcher avant la lettre, the left-wing Glaswegian MP James Maxton called a Conservative MP a murderer and was suspended from the House of Commons, much to MacDonald's fury. With the Conservatives holding a comfortable majority, no one expected an election just 13 months into that Parliament. Even more so, no one expected that that next election would sweep Labour into power. But the results of the December 1923 election were poised to do just that. On the 18th of January 1924, Winston Churchill wrote to the Times to warn the country of impending catastrophe. In apocalyptic terms, Churchill raged, "The enthronement in office of a socialist government will be a serious national misfortune, such as usually befallen great states only in the morrow of defeat in war." Unlike Churchill, his Conservative colleague Neville Chamberlain speculated that Labour would be, quote, "too weak to do much harm, but not too weak enough to get discredited." And even though Labour just held under a third of the seats in Parliament, Labour had ruled out any idea of a coalition with the Liberals and chose to govern as a minority instead. George Lansbury, the MP for Bow, said, quote, "We of the British Labour movement will as ever keep ourselves clear of that unholy thing which masquerades as liberalism." Lansbury went so far as to say that he would rather die without ever seeing a Labour government than to, quote, "see any arrangement, open or secret, with the Liberal Party." In hindsight, Labour's decision to go it alone was probably the right one. It helped to establish Labour as the alternative to the Conservative government and blocked the Liberals' access to power. And as we'll hear soon, on the 22nd of January 1924, Ramsay MacDonald was invited by King George V to form a government and become the first Labour Prime Minister. That Labour government only lasted just over 9 months and left a relatively unspectacular legislative record, no surprise given its number of seats in Parliament. Yet its mere existence quashed doubts that Labour was fit to rule and answered whether Labour was prepared to operate within the framework of the British Constitution. We might look back in hindsight and say that Labour's problem was that it entered government with few ideas of what it wanted to do. So accustomed had Labour been to opposing the two parties that it lacked a coherent domestic policy agenda. Clement Attlee believed this was partly because the Parliament had only lasted 13 months, and so Labour hadn't had time to develop its own alternative policy programme. But in general, the 1920s were not a significant time of policy development for the Labour Party. Much of the business that occupied the National Executive Committee was administrative in nature, such as questions about Labour's relationship to the Communists. Most of Labour's key figures lacked a clear sense of what they wanted to do in policy terms. MacDonald and his Chancellor, Philip Snowdon, had deep ethical views about socialism, but ultimately for them, socialism was like a faith, was a matter of men and women's hearts. It wasn't about a question of a particular programme of economic state control. And so in a pattern which has been repeated after every Labour government, after the fall of that government, the Labour grassroots and some Labour MPs repeatedly damned the memory of that 1924 government for being insufficiently radical. One Labour MP wrote, "No abiding mark, except possibly in the foreign sphere, will have been left with the first Labour government in power. In this eventuality, the cause of Labour might be retarded for a generation." And in the years to follow, MacDonald spent his time trying to persuade his comrades that government was harder than opposition. At a 1925 party conference, MacDonald told delegates that governing the country was, quote, quite different from getting resolutions passed at party conferences. In response, Campbell Stephen, a Glaswegian MP, charged there was not enough evidence sufficient to demonstrate that the Labour government was different from MacDonald's Tory government. The following year, MacDonald swore, "I can speak at no conference promoted to popularise absolutely meaningless phrases that have misled the whole of our socialist movement." And so while the 1920s were not a productive time for Labour in terms of policy, it was a productive time for Labour organisationally and in establishing itself as the main party of opposition and a potential government in British politics. The Labour Party today still lives with the legacy bequeathed by those years in opposition and government in the 1920s. Herbert Morrison, first elected Labour MP in 1923, and whose grandson Peter Mandelson is now an advisor to Labour leader Keir Starmer, reflected that the 20s, had we known it, was the shaping time for the Labour Party of the future. And we now live in that future.
You can read more in Richard's book coming out in April. You run through a lot of themes there, but I want to do a bit of the sort of personal stuff as well. And Jane, it was, to say the least, an unexpected birth, shall we say, of the first Labour government. MacDonald himself called it an insane miracle, didn't he? And it was the King, George V, called Ramsay MacDonald. I mean, Labour hadn't got anywhere near a majority, no one had. It sounds as if the Liberals and the Conservatives just sort of sat back complacently and thought, oh, give him a go. What was it like for the King, though? How did he view having to welcome into Parliament this ragbag of people who'd never served in Parliament or certainly in government before?
Well, I think that, when we... Oh, yes, we need this. Can you hear me? No.
Is there a little switch on it, maybe?
Is it on mute? No. I think it's on.
Is that on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think that the usual sort of narrative of the change of government in 1924 is one, not surprisingly, about the Labour Party and the Labour Party's, breaking through or not, whether that is at the moment that happens, that important thing. But I think that equally insane miracle was the role of the King, because George V was a pretty, his natural instincts were strongly Tory, the tweediest of Tories. His passion was shooting vast amounts of pheasants very accurately. And he certainly was not the sort of person who you would imagine would be at all approving of the idea that as king he needs to enable a Labour government. But that is precisely what he does in 1923-24, after the December 1923 election. And it is, I think, something that really does need to be explained. I mean, why was it that this Conservative monarch was the man who basically opened the door to this new left-wing party? What was it that drove George V to actually attempt to accommodate Labour rather than push it out? I mean, if you look at the results of the 1923 hung Parliament, you've got 258 Conservatives, 191 Labour, and 158 Liberals. Well, the Conservatives have ruled themselves out because Baldwin says that he won't, he's resigned, he won't take office with he won't have an overall majority. But there's no attempt to play games with the Labour and Liberals and attempt some kind of coalition, even if those parties had wanted. Instead, what happens is that we sort of gradually get the realisation that it's going to be a Labour government. This doesn't happen immediately. The election result comes through in December, and Baldwin, the Tory leader, really wants to resign immediately. But he's persuaded not to do that and to stay in office until he's defeated in the House of Commons. And as this is the Christmas recess, he doesn't actually meet Parliament until quite late in January 1924. What is George V playing at here? I think that essentially his position over Labour, in order to understand the way he's thinking, we need to go back to the 1917 Russian Revolution, the First World War. And in the 1917 revolution, of course, you get the abdication of the Romanovs, and then the sort of keeping the Romanovs under the emperors under house arrest in St. Petersburg, and then you get this terrible story which ends in August 1918 with the assassination of the Tsar and his family in Ekaterinburg. Now, this to any monarch in 1917 onwards is a terrifying picture. It's an existential crisis. And we can say a little bit about this, just briefly, just how George felt about this. If you look at the story of the asylum that was offered to the Romanovs, the British government was quite keen to do anything to keep the Russians in the war. And if that meant accepting the request of the Russians, the Russian government, the provisional government, that the Romanovs should be given asylum in Britain, the government is quite happy to do that. So, initially, these talks progress quite, it seems as though that the Romanovs will come. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, said we must ask the monarch, and initially his response is favourable. But as the days go by, it becomes very clear that actually this is not something that the king wants at all, and that the king is very much aware that if he brings the Romanovs to Britain, that they will cause a sort of spike in republicanism. And George is very frightened of republicanism because, this is the end of dynastic politics. There is the Romanovs do not receive their invitation and they do not come to Britain. And the result, I think, is that that there is this sort of lurking fear in the mind of George V that it's important to somehow try to wipe out the Republican threat, to avoid the destiny of the Romanovs, to try and sort of survive, essentially. They're very frightened of all the strikes, the waves of strikes that characterise the 1920s. This is essentially one side of George's decision to offer to offer Labour to be Prime Minister.
Jane, he must have been thinking, these guys or people that they believe in and support, murdered my relatives. Bolsheviks murdered my relatives, and here I am having to shake hands with them and give them their oaths of office.
Well, one thing he said was that, there's one thing you absolutely must not do, and that to the Labour government, and that is to give diplomatic recognition to Russia. I will not shake hands with the men who have murdered my cousins. And he meant it. And yet, at the same time, he hadn't actually given his cousins, he hadn't kept them alive, he hadn't given them asylum. So it's a sort of conflicted position that he's in. But anyway, this fear of I think the fear of the republicanism is and Bolsheviks is a very important factor. But at the same time, George V is very much aware that there is in Britain a strong vein of support for a moderate Labour Party. George V enjoyed watching football matches, and he would go to the cup finals. And when he appeared at the football match, all the these huge crowds of 70,000 people would get up and cheer. So he knew. He wrote, in fact, that no Bolsheviks there. So the objective must be, by encouraging a moderate Labour government, to split off the Republican extremists on the left and somehow contain the moderate Labour Party within the political system.
Okay, and so you had a cabinet for the first time, including miners, railwaymen, steelworkers, and you quote in your book Sir Patrick Hastings describing this first Labour government as a great adventure consisting of an untried body of men travelling in an unknown land and surrounded by countless enemies. Amazing characters. Summed up, I think, this moment when the king has to welcome a new government by the fact that they didn't have the right clothes to wear, did they, when they went to get their seals of office?
Yes, the opening line in my book is that all everyone could think of was clothes. And this came to symbolise broader tensions and conflicts in the government. So basically, MacDonald was appointed on the 22nd of January. The following day, there's a Privy Council meeting at which his new ministers have to accept their seals of office, take the oath of allegiance, and so on. Lots of new members. Only very few of them have the requisite dress for a Privy Council meeting, which is basically top hat and tails. Other members have come to London in haste. They do have the correct clothing, but they can't locate it. Others make a point of wearing very old lounge suits. So John Wheatley, the new Minister for Health and Housing, deliberately wears basically a dirty lounge suit to his first meeting with the King to make a point. But I should explain the title, The Wild Men. This was not what they called themselves. This was basically a smear, if you like. It was a line of attack from the Daily Mail, who led the charge against Labour at that time. Some things don't change. The Conservatives, an element of the Conservatives, and this, of course, was to make the link in voters' minds between the British Labour Party and the Bolshevists and the Russian revolutionaries. They wanted people to think that they were of the same ilk, and indeed later on that they were somehow taking orders from Moscow. The Wild Men, George Lansbury, I think, was probably one of the wilder MPs at that time. E.D. Morrell, who was a Dundee MP, they were excluded from the cabinet. MacDonald was absolutely clear that he couldn't have that element derailing his strategy for the Labour Party.
He didn't like them singing the red flag in Parliament either, did he?
He didn't, nor did the King. And indeed, at one of their first meetings, MacDonald says to the King, "I'm trying my best to wean the party off that kind of thing." So you can see even at that point that he's establishing a rapport with the monarch. But on coalitions, Richard mentioned that MacDonald was very anti-coalition. But the irony is that the first government was a coalition. It was a coalition of left and right within the Labour Party, but it also included liberals who converted to Labour, and also a couple of Conservatives, which is the most curious feature of that time. So the Labour, the three groups, if you like, of the Labourites, Ramsay MacDonald is seen as the preeminent figure of his generation, an intensely charismatic reformer, illegitimate son of a farmhand who never knew his father growing up in Lossiemouth. His backstory is extraordinary then as now. John Wheatley, experienced Glasgow councillor and expert in housing policy, perhaps one of the only ministers who comes to government with a genuine knowledge of his brief. He's actually quite middle class by this point. He's made a fortune from publishing Catholic calendars in the west of Scotland. So he's curiously affluent. And I think my favourite is Jimmy Thomas, a huge figure in his day, now completely forgotten. He was a Swansea-born railway union leader who again had worked his way up from grinding poverty. He becomes colonial secretary and famously declares on his first day at the colonial office that he's there to make sure there's no mucking about with the British Empire. I don't think he said mucking. I think that was sort of given a gloss at the time. Then the Liberals. I put Philip Snowden in this category because although he was a Labour MP, he'd come from a Liberal background. He was the son of a weaver. He becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer and delivers a classically Gladstonian budget. He's not channeling Marx in those proposals. He's channeling the grand old man. Then there's Viscount Haldane. Haldane had been a Liberal Lord Chancellor under Asquith and Lloyd George. And he's fascinating because he's one of the first people MacDonald contacts. He's desperate to have Haldane on board to lend sort of legitimacy to his government. He knows that he'll be acceptable to the establishment. Haldane's hugely experienced in terms of administration, the constitution, the law. And Haldane leaps at the chance to be back in government because, like MacDonald had opposed the First World War and had become a pariah for several years. Haldane's German sympathies, cultural sympathies, he spoke the language, he loved the culture, had led to him being drummed out of the government during the First World War. So for him to return to office at that time was quite sweet for him. It sort of salved the wounds from earlier in his career. And Charles Trevelyan, another sort of aristocratic Liberal who drifted to Labour because of the First World War. And he initiates quite a revolutionary change in educational policy, which is continued by future governments. And then finally, the Conservatives. Lord Chelmsford is, I think, as surprised as anyone to find himself First Lord of the Admiralty. He's a former Viceroy of India, and he protests to anyone who will listen on becoming a member of the Cabinet that he's been a Conservative all his life, and he doesn't stop being a Conservative. And then there's Hugh Macmillan. So the Scottish law officers, it's quite a niche point, but you have the Attorney General, Solicitor General for England and Wales. But in Scotland, MacDonald had to appoint 2 law officers. The convention was, for the Lord Advocate and the Solicitor General, that they had to be members of the Scottish Bar, so King's Council. There were very few Labour KCs, and he really struggled on that count. And when he attempted to appoint plain old solicitors to those posts, the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh, which is the main sort of legal body, really dug in their heels and said, you're not going to do that. And so he admitted defeat and appointed 2 Conservative MPs to those posts. And the Clydeside contingent, so the left of the Labour Party, independent Labour Party MPs from the west of Scotland, they go absolutely ballistic at those appointments. They think MacDonald's been captured by the Tory Faculty of Advocates. And that's when they start to fall out of love with MacDonald.
Very quickly.
They voted for MacDonald, as Richard described, in 1922, so the left were on board. But it's at that point that they begin to think this guy might not be the real deal.
And did he do himself harm by appointing himself as Foreign Secretary as well? Because, it's often said, isn't it, that his foreign policy objectives were good and he did achieve more in foreign policy than many expected. And yet, did that mean that he neglected domestic policy?
That's the charge, that he was a poor sort of domestic prime minister, but a very good foreign secretary. I think his calculation that there was no one else who could take on that role was probably correct. And the king warns him at the start, the last prime minister to try to do both was Lord Salisbury, and he exhausted himself. And MacDonald did, he wore himself out. But he was an excellent foreign secretary. He came to the Foreign Office with immense knowledge of European affairs. He travelled widely with his late wife. He knew all the leading players. And during 1924, he is credited with basically bringing a new or more productive atmosphere to European politics. He gets a better deal for Germany, which is being crippled by reparation payments to France.
He's really sorted the conundrum there, because there was a
Yeah.
real logjam, wasn't there?
Yeah, previous Liberal and Tory governments had tried and failed to resolve that. And then he makes a triumphant speech to the League of Nations in September, so the United Nations of its day. And yeah, even critics, even conservatives, even the Daily Mail by the end of 1924 acknowledged that MacDonald is a very fine international statesman.
But he drove himself hard, you write about that. He neglected his own health. Just one final thing, and then John, I'm going to bring you in. The reality of government. Ramsay MacDonald had his daughter running number 10. And when they moved in, you write that normally, obviously in the past, prime ministers had brought in their own furniture, and they had to scamper around, didn't they? Going to auction houses and trying to get a bit of furniture into number 10, and they could only live in a few rooms because they were the ones that were heated, and he did his shopping in the co-op.
Yeah, so the sort of staterooms in number 10 were heated at government expense, but everything else had to be covered by the incumbents. So MacDonald and his daughter Ishbel, as you say, who acted as his hostess, as they put it at the time, sort of cowered in a couple of rooms in Downing Street. Ishbel and some family friends were sent out to get cheap linen and wardrobes from auction houses. The food was delivered by the co-op. So yeah, this was a huge change. Although balancing that was Chequers. The Chequers had just come into the sort of use of the Prime Minister a few years before. And MacDonald he absolutely loved Chequers. And if you see pictures of him there, and he held summits and meetings with European leaders, he always wore the slightly preposterous sort of +4s and a tweed outfit. So he was very much playing the part of the country gentleman. But yeah, he was paid a couple of £100 a year. The salary of the Prime Minister at that point had not gone up since, I think, the 1860s.
So John, here we have a bunch of men who've been working hard, obviously Ramsay MacDonald's role in setting up the Labour Party. They finally get in to government. I mean, you know what it feels like. You get into Parliament, it's overwhelming anyway, isn't it? And suddenly you're faced with government, and you're faced with people who are waiting for you to fail. You've got to show them that you are fit to govern. Does that mean that you just have to give away any idea of being radical? You just have to manage?
Well, that's a tension that's bedeviled the history of the Labour Party, in terms of that tension between moderation and radicalism.
Yeah.
It just sort of ricochets through the last 100 years. I should say, it's a great place to talk about Labour history, Mile End, actually. So I congratulate you for organising the event this evening, because when I walk down Mile End Road, I always think you got the Bryant and May factory just down there. It was central to the 1888 Matchbook strike. You have the 1889 dock strike was run out of Jeremiah Street, barely, a mile down the road. You have Lansbury lived 39 Bow Road. Attlee lived just down there by Aldgate. Attlee set up the Stepney ILP in 1908 in Helbury House, just down the road. So this is the centre of the sort of labour and working class trade in the district. So it's a great event to have here. In terms of Ramsay MacDonald, that tension was first expressed in government. I think there was this amazing victory rally at the Albert Hall, which is really there was some amazing portraits written about this event, where you had this tension between the task of moderation and then the desire for radicalism. And it felt like a religious event in terms of the passion and the desire of the audience. That tension was obviously cracked wide open in 1931, but it sort of begs you to rethink the role of Ramsay MacDonald, I suppose, in history, because, Keir Hardie's sanctified in the movement, and arguably if Ramsay MacDonald had died in the 20s, his contribution would have been seen as equivalent to Keir Hardie. He'd been secretary for the Labour Representation Committee for 12 years. He'd been chair of the Parliamentary Committee. He cut a private deal with the Liberals that ensured the 29-seat breakthrough occurred for Labour in 1906. He was a great organiser, the best speaker of his generation, the outstanding politician of the 1920s in total, you could argue, I think. On principle, he resigned over the First World War. It cost him the chairmanship of the Parliamentary Party and his seat in Parliament for 4 years as well. So his contribution stands second to none. But it's been largely removed from Labour history because of the events of August 1931. And the waters cover over. And I think this moment does allow us to rethink his contribution, which is immense. I mean, his backstory is incredible.
Yeah, it is.
And the personal costs, in terms of the effects of the war, for example, in terms of the revealing of his illegitimacy, great personal cost, you know, but it's been largely removed. And that is, I think that, and the whole history of his contribution sort of scars the Labour Party. It needs to be retrieved, I think. And
So,
this is an opportunity to start that process.
You're talking about the fact that he is still regarded as a traitor by some in Labour, by many in Labour indeed, for turning his back on his own party and agreeing to lead a national government with the Liberals and with the Conservatives. Do you think then that when you place him in the sort of lexicon of Labour leaders, where do you think he stands? With reflection and taking, or bearing in mind the...
Well, I think he made calamitous decisions for principled reasons. Really. And I think he had this notion of the national community. I think David Howe, the historian, wrote, he had an idea of the national community that could bend towards quite conservative positions. And he wasn't sectionalist, like some elements of the Labour movement. So he had this notion of the nation and the responsibility that goes with the office that had disastrous. Arguably, I think it was David Markham who said the worst decision he made was not heeding the advice of John Maynard Keynes in terms of the response to the May Committee set up to handle the public expenditure cuts that went after the effects of the Wall Street crash. And if he had accepted the advice of Keynes, which was to go for a British New Deal, this is before Roosevelt had done it in America, and to resist the clamour for restraint and austerity, his contribution could have been absolutely extraordinary in, preceding Roosevelt and challenging the politics of austerity. And if you think about the politics of austerity in Labour, you had the Geddes Act, which had to be dealt with in terms of the 1924. You had the effects of 1929. You had Wilson's National Plan for Growth was sacrificed in 1965 in favour of control of wages and prices and austerity. Same could be said in 1977 in terms of the IMF, 2007-8 in terms of Gordon Brown and after the calamitous banking disasters. The politics of austerity is a consistent theme in Labour history, and it's a really instructive period. This in terms of I was looking at some of the obituaries to Alistair Darling last week. And a number of the writers were talking about how Gordon Brown used to tell him, "We cannot be MacDonald and Snowden. We cannot be MacDonald and Snowden." Was the refrain that was continually used just a few years ago. So this history hangs over the whole party. And it has done it. I don't think it will go away for quite a while.
But you make the point that in 100 years there have only been 6 periods of Labour government.
Right.
The first 2 are minority administrations. Labour's only been in power for 33 years. And you have got MacDonald here in that select club of 6 men who have been Prime Minister. Is that not an achievement?
Oh, totally. I mean, I see him as a genuine Labour pioneer. And we forget more than we should remember, there's a part of a lost history here, and the way that people who had agreed and signed up to the cuts in August 1931 subsequently castigated MacDonald when they had their hands dipped in this stuff. There was a culpability that they all got out from under very quickly, and that is partly the way that he's been demonised because he carried the can when so many others who wrote very melodramatically, shall we say, about his culpability. They were themselves involved right up to the hill in managing 56 million of cuts in August 31.
Yeah, please do.
Just on that point, the title of my book is The Wild Men, and all but one of the ministers were men. Margaret Bonfield, the only female minister, another first in 24.
Not a cabinet minister.
Not a cabinet minister, but the first time a woman had been a minister. in 31, she's one of the...
She is one of the 11,
She
absolutely.
castigates MacDonald, yet private correspondence reveals that she was completely on board with what MacDonald was doing.
Sidney Webb's a classic in
Yes.
this. Sidney Webb.
So they huge, incredible hypocrisy there.
Totally.
You know, one position in private, another in public. But the public stance, as John said, shaped perceptions of MacDonald for decades.
Isolated and demonised, basically.
But,
And
you know, I made a little list of some of the legislation that was passed without a majority and within 9 months. You've got Wheatley's Housing Act, a real house building programme that got started. With education, Charles Trevelyan approved the building of new schools, increased the budget for adult education. Unemployment, there was special subsidies. There was the start of a national grid, or at least the thinking about it. Insurance Act to increase unemployment benefits. And then you mentioned Snowden. Well, his first budget cut both direct and indirect taxation. And many people at the time hailed it a victory, didn't they, for working people? So you know, the achievements were there. But is it just that history won't allow us to look back at them with anything but derision?
well, it's really, I think it's really interesting that still Labour doesn't... I mean, it's a really interesting question about how Labour celebrates its history, because you haven't heard much today from the Labour Party.
No.
I remember in
Has there
2000...
been anything different today, any special events?
In 2000, it was the 100th centenary of the setting up the Labour Representation Committee, and there was hardly anything. I just left Downing Street at the time, and there was quite a bit of a debate about whether there should be genuine celebrations. There was a small unveiling in Farringdon Road of a statue, but there was not a lot going on. New Labour tended to focus on the future rather than the past, even though Blair and Brown were very keen to excavate Labour history to justify what New Labour were doing with recourse to debates with new liberalism in the early period of the 20th century. But Labour tends not to celebrate these moments in its past, and arguably I think it should do, because it shines a light on some of the challenges it faced today.
Do you have any comments about, I'd like to move on to the wider lessons from 24, but just to a final comment about the 24 government and whether he was able to prove the naysayers wrong. Were there achievements that you think have been underestimated?
Well, I think you have picked up on a lot of them, Carolyn, but as I mentioned in my remarks, there was this perception almost as soon as Labour lost that 24 election that the government was a bit of a damp squib. So MacDonald faces an immediate challenge from the left of the Labour Party for his leadership after the 1924 election, even though Labour wins 1 million more votes than it had in December 23. And actually George Lansbury is proposed by the left of the party to challenge him. And MacDonald is basically saved by the fact that Lansbury says, well, we're not having this, I'm not going to challenge him. But MacDonald is furious with the left of the party. He says they're out for my blood. And what you can also see as time goes on with MacDonald is that he grows increasingly impatient with the left of the Labour Party. This began when he became leader of the official opposition. It worsened when he became Prime Minister, and it became even worse sort of after he lost government, because he felt that he had achieved so much under such odds, and he wasn't getting credit for it from much of the Labour grassroots.
And Jane, do you have any sense how the King felt when he saw this insane miracle vanishing really after just 9 months? Because he did build up quite a decent relationship with Ramsay MacDonald, didn't he?
He certainly did. I mean, he made rather a nice comment when the government began, and he said, today, 23 years ago, in January 1901, dear Grandmama, that's Queen Victoria, died. I wonder what she would have thought of a Labour government. So, I mean, he certainly had moved on as a result of this government. He'd become much more politically inclusive and tolerant. I think that there's quite a lot to show, evidence to show, that George was, this is the sort of thing you need biographers to write as well as historians. But that there was a very strong relationship between the king and his prime minister. And there's rather a strange scene that happened after Ramsay MacDonald had to resign in 1924. And the king says to him, "You have found me an ordinary man, haven't you?" With the this is a comment actually on George's style of monarchy. It had to be like an ordinary family life, and the ordinariness was very important to his whole reign. And I think that these two men did manage to cooperate in an extraordinary way. But of course, as we've been hearing, once it came to 1931 and the formation of the the national government, a lot of people at the time and historians subsequently have argued that basically the king acted in an unconstitutional way in almost commanding Ramsay MacDonald to take office, and 3 times telling him he's got to become prime minister, and so much so that he embraces Ramsay MacDonald, and Ramsay MacDonald couldn't resist that. The king's arm around his shoulder. And it almost becomes like a sort of 18th century monarch, doesn't it? Appointing, George III and Lord Bute. But there was something that I think George V understood about Ramsay, with his wonderful tweeds and his silk, his elegance, and his Scottishness, and that goes back perhaps to sort of Balmoral and shooting and very smart gillies tweed. And he finds, I think, if you look at all the prime ministers of his reign, Ramsay MacDonald was certainly George V's favourite prime minister.
And he asked Ramsay MacDonald to step forward, and in doing so, Ramsay MacDonald had to step away from his own party, didn't he? And thereafter, the treachery charges continued. Just a final comment on that, and then I'd just like to talk a bit more about current parallels.
Yeah, it's quite melodramatic. I think Labour can be melodramatic. It's called The Great Betrayal that MacDonald made in 1931. And just to go back to a point John made about how the party approaches it, it's not till David Marquand writes his very elegant biography, The Year I Was Born, 1977, on MacDonald, that people take a more sort of sympathetic view of his contribution to the party. But even that doesn't really do the trick. That book is well reviewed. It's a solid piece of work. But no mention today from sort of formal sources. There's been plenty of media activity and all the rest of it. But yeah, it's quite striking.
And John, bring it up to date and current parallels. And if we're looking at the current wannabe Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and his political priorities and direction of travel, you say in your book that he travels light compared to ideologues such as MacDonald. He appears detached from the deeper intellectual traditions that have shaped the history of Labour. You've been quoted quite a lot recently as not being terribly helpful to Keir Starmer. You say he's an elusive leader. To gain and retain power and navigate the complexities of government, having ditched the commitments upon which Starmer was first elected as leader, guarantees a complicated future relationship with his party. And just one other quote from your very own book. The character of the modern party and its leader is vague, and the policy prospectus has dramatically truncated. So, what happens next?
I tell you the point I was trying to make.
Were you being helpful, John? Were you being helpful? Candid friend and all that?
I tell you how I see this, Caroline. And don't just look at this through the lens of how political journalists treat what you say.
Just quoting the words.
Sometimes removes nuance and complexity to some of the arguments. But what I would say is, look, if you look at someone like Ramsay MacDonald, he had been secretary to the Labour Representation Committee for 12 years. He'd written 12 books on the nature of socialism and the Labour Party. He was a real ideologue. You could argue that there's been 23 leaders of the Labour Party. All of them have come through the Labour Party. attached to factions, bodies of work, ideologies, political positions that they carry with them. So they have definition, right? And I would argue that compared to virtually all of them, Keir Starmer doesn't. Partly because of the position Labour was in 2019, but he does travel light compared to these other Labour leaders in terms of a body of work, an intellectual, ideological paper trail. There's not as much there. That gives him great agility, so he moves quickly. He's moved very quickly from the agenda that he got elected on. It does create that
pivoting.
speed.
He pivots a lot, you say.
He does pivot
Yeah.
from certain positions, but you know, I think that's objectively true, and I think you've got to scrutinise why that is and how he can, and I think that's because he, compared to other leaders, he's not tied to factions and positions. Now that does create an elusive quality as well. That goes with the agility, and we'll see how that all plays out. I think you can see things building in terms of political positions, but I think, you know, that's a fair description. I'll stand by it, if that's okay.
Richard, what do you make of parallels then and now, and what the task is for Starmer?
Well, John's talked about some of the differences of Starmer and MacDonald. Some of the similarities might be the sense that, both of them had come to power in the party from support of the left, but then, in effect, defined their leadership by taking on the left of the party. Now, Starmer presumably doesn't want to carry that story all the way to its logical conclusion in the way that MacDonald did. But there is, if you look at MacDonald's leadership, there is almost a growing paranoia and obsession that he has with the Clydesiders and George Lansbury, who he derides as the John Bull of Poplar, who he really detests, and starts to lose sense of what value within the Labour coalition these different ideas might have. I think David is correct to see Labour as a coalition. It has always historically been a coalition. And it works best not when there's no dissent, not when there's no frustration, but when that dissent and frustration is recognised and channeled for productive purposes. Obviously, we're not here to discuss Harold Wilson, but I think Wilson is an example of a leader who did that very skillfully and adeptly, more so than MacDonald, for example.
Look, splits and factions have plagued Labour, haven't they? They've always been there. There is a current split at the moment. What's he to do about Jeremy Corbyn, for instance? What do you think?
Well, I think that dies cast, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
So
that's an example of the current dilemma. But look, if you look at the task that Keir Starmer's got now, and the challenges, they're economic,
right,
environmental. Look at the geopolitical dimension as well. In your estimation, would you say that the challenges for him are far greater than any previous wannabe Prime Minister?
I would. Look, on the one hand, just to finish some of my comments about Keir Starmer, he's done an extraordinary job. If there's only been 3 Labour leaders who won the majorities at a general election, if he became the 4th this year, then that is a historic achievement by a Labour leader. And in terms of where we were in terms of his inheritance in 2019, when we got the lowest number of seats since 1935, I think. In 1935 we were going up, in 2019 we were going down. So, to contextualise what he's done, that's a fantastic achievement to be where we are now. But he is likely to have the worst inheritance of any Labour leader in history, I think, even compared to Attlee, in terms of the cost of living crisis, catastrophes in climate change, the technological challenges in terms of epochal changes that challenge the basis of humanity itself, actually. All of these things mean that, it's going to be very, very difficult for him. It's a huge challenge, commensurate with any other challenge of any leader in history, I think.
Yeah, and David, we were talking before we started about Scotland and the challenge there, and Keir Starmer obviously wants to win more Scottish seats. Some estimates say he doesn't really need that many. Others say he'd need about 40 to get anywhere near a majority. He's got to gain 120 odd seats to get a majority in government. You've covered Scotland a lot. Just give us a quick word on that.
So if I comment on that, I'll get sacked.
Oh, will you? I don't want that to happen.
But 100 years ago, in another parallel, Scotland was a big issue. So the Clydesiders, the Independent Labour Party, were huge home rulers, as was MacDonald until the moment he becomes Prime Minister. One of the last big speeches he makes in December 23, he's talking about Scottish distinctiveness, its superiority in the legal and educational sphere, and that this needs to be recognised with a devolved Scottish Parliament. As soon as he takes office as Prime Minister, he moves on to other things. He responds very abruptly to letters from sort of fellow home rulers saying, "You're Prime Minister, can you do something about this?" And when the Clydesiders, out of frustration, introduce a bill for Home Rule for Scotland or devolution, a few months later, it's talked out, and MacDonald almost smugly refuses more time for this bill and writes to the King saying, "I've vanquished the left." You know, the look on their face when I said they wouldn't get any more time was quite a picture. So he very swiftly leaves behind that side of his character. As I say, John mentioned Keir Hardie. Hardie and MacDonald were extremely close. MacDonald writes gushingly about Hardie throughout his career. And Hardie, of course, was a home ruler. It was a key plank of Labour's platform from the start, but MacDonald did nothing to advance that. And I'll just end on this point. The consequence of that was quite significant, because the Home Rule movement in Scotland, who'd vested a lot of hope in the Labour Party to deliver this, were so disillusioned by the end of 24 that they resolved to set up their own party, and that party, after a few years, becomes the Scottish National Party.
Can I just thank John Cruddas, David Torrance, Jane Ridley, and Dr. Richard Johnson for these.